Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of Vietnam. We've been talking about the period in the mid-1960s when American involvement and escalation of the war in Vietnam was ongoing. In this lecture, we'll continue talking about that process, including some of the most prominent features of combat during this era, bombing runs and search and destroy missions. By 1966, Lyndon Johnson's frustration with the situation in Vietnam was almost inconsolable. George Ball finally resigned as Assistant Secretary of State in June of 1966. McGeorge Bundy left the White House as well, the National Security Advisor. Johnson replaced them with men who would be less critical of the war effort. Still, by summer 1966, Johnson was frustrated and confused. At one point he confided to Lady Bird, his wife, "Victory after victory doesn't really mean victory. I can't get out. I can't finish it with what I've got, so what the hell do I do?" In April 1967, Johnson brought General Westmoreland home to explain to Congress his continued request for more troops. The general gave a rousing speech and was greeted with applause. Still, it was difficult to question the man whose job it was to win the war. But the news from the battlefront was getting less promising. The bombing campaigns had failed to destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail. To the contrary, it had become very efficient. In 1963, the trail was primitive, one small trail through the jungles. It took a full month of marching 18-hour days to reach the south. Even by 1964, there were nearly 500,000 peasants at work on the trail. They widened it and paved it in stretches. Ultimately, there were 10 different roads running parallel to each other in certain heavily bombed areas. There were underground fuel tanks, hospitals, and supply centers. By 1965, they could move 5,000 men and 4,000 tons of supplies every month. By 1967, as I noted previously, some 12,000 trucks were estimated on the road at all times. In general, the bombing campaigns were not as effective as had been hoped. The North Vietnamese economy was largely agricultural. Industrial centers, in some cases, were bombed into oblivion, which did hurt, but it didn't destroy the economy. The North Vietnamese also evacuated much of the population out of the cities and into the countryside. By 1967, it was estimated that the population of Hanoi dropped from a peak of about 1 million to less than 250,000. The North Vietnamese also rebuilt almost immediately anything that was destroyed. Roads and bridges were replaced quickly, within days. The Soviets also helped to fund rebuilding projects and sent supplies. Now, the bombing runs did have an effect. They were estimated to kill or wound almost 3,000 North Vietnamese every month in 1967. Most of the major cities were badly damaged, and industry was set back perhaps by as much as 10 years. But they still had agriculture, and the people grew more determined with each bombing run. The bombing runs were also limited by the weather. Trucks and ground troops of the North Vietnamese could continue moving, even while American bombers were grounded for rain or poor visibility. It was impossible to stem the tide of supplies and troops moving south. North Vietnamese air defenses also improved quickly. They used Soviet surface-to-air missiles and trained some pilots of their own. They deployed some 7,000 anti-aircraft batteries, and literally millions of people trained their automatic and semi-automatic weapons on American aircraft. So American pilots had to fly at higher altitudes and were more likely to miss their targets. Also, many of their runs were spent firing at anti-aircraft sites rather than their intended targets. Finally, the air war had a negative psychological effect in the United States, as pilots shot down became prisoners of war. Hundreds of American pilots became prisoners of war, which became strong incentive for the United States to negotiate and eroded popular support for the war at home. In 1965 and 66, the range of bombing runs was gradually expanded to include areas near Hanoi and Haiphong, and by the end of June 1966, even included those cities. All areas in North Vietnam were now subject to bombings. As the war escalated, the United States tried other methods. Defoliation was one, simply clearing large stretches of land or killing off the jungles and vegetation. The intent was to expose the enemy, who were experts at leaping in and out of the jungles to hide themselves. But it worked in reverse as well. American soldiers then working in such areas were exposed and sometimes had to run hundreds of yards to reach cover themselves. Throughout 1966 and 67, the typical mission for American ground forces were search and destroy missions. As a means of waging war, the ground forces were airlifted into an area where the enemy was supposed to be, and then upon detection of the enemy, they would call in artillery and airstrikes. This was putting the ground troops at risk, but the intent was not for them to engage in large-scale attacks themselves, but rather to call in airstrikes to take out the enemy. And yet, these missions encountered many different kinds of problems. The rain, weather, immersion of their feet, leeches, and landmines, which caused about a third of all American casualties in the war. As one officer described the search and destroy missions, "You don't fight this fellow rifle to rifle. You locate him and back away, blow the hell out of him, and then police up." The idea behind this strategy was to rely on America's greatest strength, which was firepower and technology. And yet this reliance on so-called techno-war led to a number of contradictions. For one, it was loud. The enemy always seemed to know where the American forces were. It always seemed that our troops set off smoke streamers to designate the landing zone, and the enemy as well could spot those smoke streamers and could choose to engage or not. The enemy also became very adept at observing American helicopter flight patterns, and they were familiar with when and where the American troops were going to arrive. A related issue to this was radio traffic. In the American system, there was constant back and forth over the radio wires between troops and forces on the ground and those back at the base, often receiving orders from their commanding officers. Well, these radio signals were picked up not only by American troops, but by enemy forces as well. They were announcing their actions to the enemy. As one officer said, "The enemy knew everything there was to know about us. They knew when we were going to strike, where we were going to strike, under what conditions, ground, air, or naval. This kind of information permitted the enemy to achieve results out of all proportion or relative commitment to firepower." In contrast, the enemy rarely relied on radio traffic and such communication back and forth. They traveled in small independent groups which could engage on their own terms. Finally, the massive bombardment also provided many weapons for the enemy. About 2% of all bombs, it was estimated, wound up unexploded. Bombs or weapons on the ground. These were collected by the enemy and either used for themselves or made into landmines. So search and destroy missions became in many cases an ambush for the enemy. So the tactical advantage always lay with the Viet Cong or North Vietnamese. As many as 80% of all engagements were initiated by the enemy. That is, they could see where the American troops were, they knew the nature of the attack, and they could decide whether to lay back and wait for another day or whether to attack at that time. In our next lecture, we'll discuss even more of the troubles with American attacks during this period.